What drives a child to sit in a blizzard with nothing but a desperate sign and a loyal dog for company? Sometimes, the wounds we hide are deeper than any words. What would you do if the only family you had left was a scarred dog, and all you could offer was a spot beside you in the cold? On a bitter night in Traverse City, a grieving officer stumbled upon a shivering girl and her German shepherd, setting off a chain of silent sacrifices, second chances, and hard-won hope. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about what happens when broken souls find the courage to stay, to heal, and to love again. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't leave until the last moment. The ending may just change what you believe about family, loss, and the quiet miracles hiding in plain sight. The first real snowstorm of December had settled deep into Traverse City, draping every roof and pine branch in heavy white. Even the familiar shapes along Front Street were transformed, softened, erased beneath the endless hush. Streetlights glowed faint amber against the storm, their halos swallowed quickly by the thick curtain of falling flakes. Past midnight, the world shrank. There were only the slow plows making groaning passes down the avenues, a handful of porch lights bravely holding back the dark, and the crunch of tired tires weaving a silent path through unbroken drifts. Inside his cruiser, Leonard Len Bishop let the heat run but kept the window cracked. He liked the sharpness of the cold air, the way it stung his face and reminded him he was still part of the living world. At 57, his joints ached more in the cold, especially at this hour, but he welcomed the ache. He'd been driving these midnight loops for years, long after most would have retired, long after he stopped believing the world had any new surprises to offer him. Tonight felt quieter than most, a kind of emptiness even the police radio seemed to respect. Len kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting absently on his old canvas notebook, thumb tapping a gentle, private rhythm. The city was a tapestry of memories, most stitched with silence. He had learned to count on these hours for their stillness, the kind that let old ghosts speak in small ways. Out here, past the edge of the tourist shops and summer marinas, winter revealed what was left behind: abandoned bikes in snowbanks, flickering neon in a diner window, footprints already filling with new snow. The intersection by Cherry Bend Road was always a bit darker, the streetlight here more shadow than illumination, casting long, blue-tinged shapes over the icy sidewalk. As Len eased the cruiser toward the old bus shelter, something tugged at him. A shift in the landscape, a break in the pattern. A single figure sat hunched beneath the plexiglass awning, small enough to be mistaken for someone's lost bundle of laundry. At this hour, in this cold, no one should be waiting for anything. Len pulled the car to the curb, engine idling in the hush. He didn't hurry. Years on the job had taught him how to let a moment breathe. He watched through the windshield, studying the tableau. A girl, no more than 13, knees drawn up to her chest, her head buried in a jacket too thin for this kind of night. Beside her, pressed close against the curve of her body, sat a German shepherd, a big female, fur patchy in places, ribs visible even beneath her thick winter coat. A small puppy huddled between the dog's paws, shivering, almost disappearing into the shelter of its mother's body. In front of them, propped against the shelter's bench, a piece of cardboard, the edges curling with damp, letters written in a hurried, careful hand. $25, please help, for food. There was something about the girl's posture, the way she clung to the dog with one arm while the other hand fidgeted with a loose string on her sleeve, that spoke of having waited a long time. Not just for a ride, but for something bigger. The snow swirled in eddies around them, the wind slipping through the cracked plexiglass, dusting the girl's hair, the dog's back, leaving them both streaked in white. Len let himself breathe in the silence. The girl didn't notice him at first. The dog, though, she watched, one ear cocked, body tensed as if she'd learned to expect the worst. No bark, not even a low growl, just a steady, unwavering gaze. It reminded Len of the way his own son had looked at him on long, wordless days, years ago. Wary, but wanting to trust. He sat a moment longer before stepping out, boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. The cold hit him full in the face. He zipped his coat, slipped his hands out of his gloves, and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the shelter. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if they were all right. Sometimes words only made things harder. He stood a few feet away, waiting for the girl to look up. She didn't, not right away. Instead, her fingers tightened on the German shepherd's fur, her shoulder shrinking back. The dog shifted, putting herself between the girl and the man in uniform, a silent shield. The puppy whimpered, so soft it nearly disappeared beneath the wind. Above them, the streetlight flickered and buzzed, a tiny universe of moths circling its dying warmth. Across the street, the lights of an all-night bakery blinked out, leaving just the blue glow of a soda machine and the indifferent hush of snow on glass. Len noticed the girl's sneakers, too small, the canvas split along the seam, wet through. Her jeans were worn, the cuffs ragged. The hand clutching the cardboard sign was red with cold, knuckles raw. No gloves. He thought of his own boy, years gone, and the echo that winter always brought. A memory he never let himself name out loud. Sometimes he wrote about it in the notebook, but tonight, he just stood in the stillness, letting it rise and recede in the hush. He could have called for backup, radioed in, started a protocol, but he knew instinctively that what mattered was not to startle, not to rush, not to break the fragile thread that kept this little group together. Instead, he simply bent down, slowly, so he was eye level with the girl and the dog. He placed one bare hand on the icy seat of the bench beside her, letting the cold seep in, matching her discomfort. He didn't ask why she was here. He didn't demand to see her face. He just waited, letting the moment fill with breath and the quiet shiver of wind. The German shepherd's eyes never left his, the kind of steady, haunted gaze that knew both cruelty and kindness, and had learned to expect neither for long. Somewhere behind them, a plow scraped the street, orange lights swirling. The world kept moving, but under the shelter, time held its breath. In that moment, as snow piled in drifts at their feet and the night pressed in close, 3 souls, man, child, and dog, sat together, each holding the weight of their own silence. And in that pause, without a word, the slow miracle of being seen, of not being turned away, began to unfold. The snow kept falling, finer now, settling in silent layers across the town. In the dim pool of light under the bus shelter, every movement slowed, as if the world itself was hesitant to intrude on what was happening there. Len stood close, but not too close. Enough for the girl and the dog to feel his presence without feeling cornered. It was a kind of distance he had learned to keep, not just as an officer, but as someone who knew what it was to be wounded, what it meant to carry sadness like a stone in the pocket of your coat. He studied the trio with a patience born from years of waiting. The girl, small and still as a field mouse, her thin coat patched at the elbows. The German shepherd, older than her eyes, posture wary but unmoving, the faintest tremor visible in her muscles as she guarded the little group. The puppy, weak and trembling, pressed so close to its mother that only the tip of a damp nose was visible from beneath her foreleg. On the girl's knees, the cardboard sign quivered with the cold wind. There was no crowd to see her, no passing cars, only the cold night, the officer, and the two dogs. Len didn't speak. He let the hush linger, letting his own breathing slow to match the silent rhythm of the snow. The girl, noticing him at last, raised her chin just enough to reveal a face framed with limp brown hair, cheeks stung red by the wind. Her eyes were swollen with exhaustion, but also with a determined kind of fear, one that didn't look for pity, only for safety. She looked at him, but only for a moment. Her gaze darted down again, and her fingers curled tighter into the dog's fur, as if holding to a lifeline. The German shepherd shifted, pushing her body ever so slightly more in front of the girl. It was an old habit, Len realized, not one of defiance but of defense. He recognized it because he'd seen it before, once in the eyes of his wife, years ago, shielding their boy from the careless remarks of strangers. Later, in the mirror, after he'd lost them both, that same quiet guard rising up in himself, unbidden and unspoken. Wind pushed a flurry of snow through the cracked pane, scattering crystals across the shelter's bench. Len slipped his gloves into his pocket, bare hands exposed to the raw air. A small gesture of openness. He crouched, joints protesting, and set himself at their level. The girl flinched at first, but when he simply sat and let his hands rest, palms up on his knees, her shoulders eased by a fraction. Trust, he knew, was never won by force. It was only ever invited. He looked past her, letting his gaze fall instead on the sign. The writing was careful, every letter spaced apart, each word taking up as little room as possible. $25. Please help. For food. There was no plea, no story, just the facts and the hope that someone, anyone, might stop. Len reached slowly for the thermos he kept tucked in the pocket of his coat. The same battered metal flask he'd carried since his army days. Without a word, he poured a small cup of cocoa, steam curling in the frigid air, and set it gently on the edge of the bench within reach. The aroma drifted, warm and sweet. A small comfort. He did not push it toward her, did not insist. He only waited. A long moment passed. The girl, lips chapped, eyes rimmed with worry, looked at the cup. Her fingers hovered, then drew back. The German shepherd sniffed the air, then nosed the girl's hand with silent encouragement. The puppy shifted and whimpered, making a feeble attempt to burrow deeper beneath its mother's chest. At last, the girl reached for the cup, hands shaking just slightly as she curled them around the warmth. She took a careful sip, then another, the steam painting her face with a pale ghost of comfort. She did not thank him with words. Instead, she pressed the cup to her cheek, eyes closed, holding that brief moment of heat, as if it might last her through the night. Len watched, saying nothing. He saw the way the German shepherd's eyes softened just a little, her tail brushing the girl's leg, the silent language of comfort passing between them. He knew that language, the one made not of words, but of the simple presence of another living thing, steady and unwavering beside you. The girl broke off a piece of bread from a crumpled paper bag at her side. She did not eat it herself. Instead, she tore it in two, placing the larger half in front of Magnus, who sniffed it politely before taking it with a kind of dignity that only hungry dogs know. The rest she tucked beneath her coat, sharing with the puppy, her own belly rumbling beneath the thin fabric. Only when both dogs were fed did she allow herself a tiny bite. Above them, snow tapped on plexiglass. A passing truck, muffled by distance and snow, sent a ripple of light along the street, before vanishing again. The girl's shoulders sagged with fatigue, but she kept her hands resting on Magnus's back, tracing slow circles in the matted fur. Each touch was a promise. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Len let his gaze drift over the shelter, old advertisements peeling on the walls, a single mitten frozen to the seat, the ghost of last summer's graffiti peeking through beneath a veil of frost. These were the places where people ended up when there was nowhere else to go. He wondered how long she'd sat here, how many cars had passed without stopping. The German shepherd shifted, exhaling a long sigh, laying her head on the girl's knee. Len noticed the dog's hind leg, scarred, healed badly, a remnant of some old injury. The fur there grew in clumps, bare patches where skin shone pink and tender. He recognized that kind of wound too. Not enough to stop you, just enough to remind you always that you'd been hurt before. Len reached into his coat for a moment, fingers brushing the notebook, but he didn't write anything down. Not yet. Tonight was not for recording. It was for staying. He waited with them as the night deepened, letting his own presence fill the silence. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply not leaving. He stayed as the snow fell, as April's head drooped with exhaustion, as Magnus kept her silent vigil, as the puppy's breath grew thin and shallow. He stayed because he understood, more than most, that sometimes you save someone not by speaking, but by being the one who does not turn away. In the hush beneath the storm, wounds without names found their echo in 3 beating hearts, each learning by degrees that even in the coldest dark, you could hold on to hope by holding on to each other. The storm pressed on, softening the world outside the shelter until Traverse City itself seemed no more than a faded memory. The hush had its own weight, a silence that filled the gaps between breathing, a cold that seeped deep into the bones. It was the kind of night that made most folks double-check their doors and settle under blankets, grateful for warmth, for family, for not being out there. Len sat beside the little group, careful not to invade their space. He watched the way April's gaze drifted over the street, scanning for headlights that never appeared, and then settled back into the folds of her own worries. Magnus shifted now and then, a silent anchor, never restless, never truly at ease. The puppy's breathing grew shallow, but April kept her hand on its tiny back, fingers trembling but steady. In that posture there was a fierce protectiveness, a small hand refusing to let go, even as the world threatened to pull everything else away. Len reached for the thermos once more, poured a little cocoa into the same paper cup, this time letting the steam curl toward the girl before nudging it an inch closer. April hesitated, then accepted, eyes lowered, voice still locked inside her chest. She held the cup close, letting the warmth bleed into her knuckles. Her other hand found a thread on her sleeve and twisted it, a nervous ritual that seemed older than she was. Len let the silence build. He had long ago learned that comfort is rarely given in words. It is built slowly, in the willingness to wait beside someone else's pain. He let his own thoughts drift, to the years he'd spent trying to patch over his own grief with late nights and paperwork, to the way his hands still searched the dark for a smaller hand that wasn't there. Sometimes he felt he'd become little more than a shadow, a figure in a uniform, carrying a notebook full of moments he could never fix. April took another sip. Her eyelids fluttered. The puppy pressed closer, its body barely more than a fistful of fur and bone. Magnus shifted to rest her chin on April's knee, exhaling a breath that fogged in the cold. That sound gentle and steady, seemed to fill the shelter with something softer than sadness, an acceptance, a kind of silent hope. There was movement in April's lap as she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a crust of bread. It was nothing really, half stale, unevenly torn. She broke it carefully into 3 pieces, the largest for Magnus, a crumb for the puppy, and the smallest tucked into her own mouth. She chewed with a patience that spoke of habit. Magnus waited for a nod, then ate with slow dignity, never snapping, never pleading. Len noticed the look in April's eyes as she watched her animals eat. There was a hunger there, yes, but more than that, a resolve, as if she believed her job in the world was to go hungry so that these creatures might have a chance. He recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in other children, in women waiting in hospital corridors, in men clutching folded flags at the end of long funerals. It was the quiet sacrifice of those who'd already learned what it was to lose. He let his hand hover over his pocket where his notebook waited, but didn't move. This was not a moment to write. It was a moment to bear witness. The wind rattled the plastic walls, dusting the group with new snow. Len shifted, and as he did, he caught the edge of the cardboard sign. April saw him glance and, after a breath, whispered something so faint it nearly vanished in the dark. "My grandma's in the hospital," she said. "I can't feed them. I was trying to get money for food, that's all." She didn't look up, as if afraid to see what the admission might cost her. The words fell into the cold, small and unadorned. She did not mention her own hunger, her own fear. Only the dogs mattered. Magnus pressed closer, the heat of her body a fragile barrier against the cold. The puppy whimpered, and April stroked its back with aching gentleness. Her other hand cradled the cup, thumb tracing circles against the rim. Len's throat tightened, the words he might have said caught behind years of learning not to intrude. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a granola bar, a battered, half-smashed thing that had lived there for weeks. He set it down on the bench, close enough for April to reach, but not so close as to make her feel watched. She glanced at it, then him, then Magnus. She did not take it. Instead, she broke off another piece of her bread for the dog. It was then that Len realized. This was not a girl begging for help. This was a child trying against all odds to keep the pieces of her small family together, no matter what she had to give up. He glanced at Magnus, whose gaze never left April's face. The dog's loyalty was an unspoken bond, forged in shared hardship. There were scars along Magnus's flank, thin white lines almost invisible beneath the winter fur. Len wondered about the stories behind them. How many times this dog had shielded April from things worse than weather. April leaned back, eyelids heavy, lips pale from cold and fatigue. For a moment, she seemed to relax, as if the presence of someone else, someone who would not take, would not judge, was enough to let her breathe easier. Len let the silence hold. He kept his own breathing slow and even, his posture open, hands resting on his knees. Above them, the snow whispered against the shelter. Across the street, a pair of headlights drifted by, their glow glancing off wet pavement before disappearing into the night. April's eyes, half closed, drifted to the granola bar. With a hesitant movement, she took it, broke it in two, and pressed the smaller half into Len's palm. Their eyes met, briefly, her gaze wary, but searching for something true. He accepted without a word. Sometimes a gesture is the whole of what can be offered. The closest one comes to trust. The puppy yawned, a tiny sound swallowed by the dark. Magnus nudged April's hand, warm breath curling between her fingers. Len leaned back, letting the chill seep through his coat. He knew this was only the beginning, that the night would not be solved with a cup of cocoa and half a granola bar. But in this sliver of shelter, under a broken light, 3 hearts sat together, each battered, each refusing to leave. In the world beyond the glass, winter raged. But here, for a moment, the cold was held at bay by the simple, stubborn act of staying. The snow eased for a time, settling instead into a heavy gray hush that blanketed Traverse City and seemed to hold even the birdsong in abeyance. In the faint glow before dawn, the world felt smaller, the roads and alleys narrowing beneath drifts of white and the deepening quiet that pressed in on every side. There were no footprints on the sidewalk outside the bus shelter. No one else awake. No one else watching. Just the breathing of 3 beings, and the slow, shared warmth of hope reluctant to surface. Len stood, careful not to disturb April's grip on Magnus, and moved with a slowness that matched the hour. He didn't ask permission. Instead, he waited, gaze lowered, letting April choose whether to trust him or not. There was no rush in the movement. He adjusted the flap of his coat, unbuttoned it against the cold, and reached out his hand not to take but to offer. Magnus watched him with eyes dark and deep, ears pitched slightly forward, not in threat but in vigilance. April hesitated, knuckles white where she clutched the tangle of leash and cardboard, then gave a small nod. It wasn't consent so much as surrender to the way of things. She was cold, she was tired, and this officer had waited long enough without judgment. Len led them to his cruiser, careful to open the back door for Magnus first, letting the dog leap in, paws wet and fur speckled with ice. The puppy was swaddled in April's coat, pressed close against her ribs. She sat rigidly, refusing to lean back, her eyes fixed on the world passing by through glass etched with frost. Len turned the heater to its highest setting, not speaking as he drove. The only sound, the muted whir of the fan, and the occasional whimper from the small bundle in April's arms. Traverse City at this hour was a world of absence. Stores shuttered, Christmas lights blinking in empty windows, the bakery's sign flickering blue in the pre-dawn. The houses along the edge of town grew farther apart, trees standing sentinel beneath their weight of snow. Len drove slow, taking the route he remembered from years before, each turn opening a new memory he had thought long buried. April's house appeared at the end of a narrow lane, nearly hidden by pines and the shadow of an old mailbox leaning at an angle. The roof was caked with snow, a thin plume of smoke barely visible from the crooked chimney. Len parked outside and waited for April to gather herself. She did so in silence, gently unwrapping the puppy and placing it in Magnus's waiting paws before stepping out into the cold. The front yard was scattered with the debris of another life, a tricycle half buried near the porch, a broken birdhouse, a row of faded marigolds now shriveled beneath the ice. April led the way with small, determined steps, Magnus never more than an arm's length away. The front door, paint peeling and hinges groaning, opened into a narrow hallway heavy with the scent of wood smoke and something older, an old woman's perfume, or maybe just the ghost of better days. Inside, the house was smaller than Len had expected, but every inch held a history. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, the linoleum underfoot cracked and yellowed. In the living room, a threadbare couch stood opposite a small wood stove, its belly glowing faintly with embers. There were photographs tacked along one wall, their colors faded by years and sunlight. April as a toddler, a woman Len guessed was her grandmother, a younger man with laughing eyes who was probably long gone. There was a dog, too, in some of the pictures, though not Magnus, a mutt with floppy ears and a wide, patient grin. April moved through the house with a gentle wariness, like someone used to making herself small. She set the puppy on a worn quilt near the stove, Magnus immediately curling around it, tongue reaching to lick its ears with that careful tenderness reserved for the most fragile things. The puppy whimpered and coughed, and April winced at the sound, but said nothing. Len, feeling suddenly like an intruder, knelt by the stove. He added a log, nudging the embers until a new flame caught. He didn't speak, he simply worked, letting the quiet be enough. The warmth spread slowly, touching the edges of the small room, inviting April to sit. She did, perching on the arm of the couch, feet tucked beneath her, hands folded in her lap. There was no question about parents, none needed. The silence told its own story. The single pair of boots by the door, the stack of hospital bills on the kitchen counter, the lonely teacup on the table, a blanket folded and waiting for a body that would not come home tonight. Magnus stood sentry at the puppy's side, her head lowered, breathing slow and measured. April sat close, laying her cheek against the dog's back, eyes closed as if drawing strength from the steady heartbeat beneath her ear. Len looked away, turning his attention to the rest of the house. The photograph of a man in uniform, a faded postcard from somewhere warm, letters written in careful, looping script and pinned to the refrigerator. Reminders of better times, maybe, or simply of survival. After a while, April unwrapped a towel and began to clean the puppy, her movements slow and precise, as if ritual offered a comfort that words could not. Magnus watched every move, never interfering, just a silent guardian, eyes bright in the firelight. Len moved to the kitchen, filled a bowl with water, and set it by the stove. April glanced at him, just once, briefly, but that was enough to say thank you. He rummaged in a cupboard for a can of beans, heating it on the stove without comment. When it was ready, he ladled out a small bowl and set it near April. She nodded, then broke off a piece of bread and placed it beside the bowl, not for herself, but for Magnus. The night outside receded, the world shrinking to a single point of light within 4 thin walls. Len watched as April read a letter pinned to the fridge, her lips moving silently, perhaps repeating words she needed to remember. Magnus sighed and lay down, eyelids drooping, content for a moment to rest, knowing her girl was safe. In the hush of the house, with the snow piling up outside and the fire crackling low, Len realized that healing sometimes looked like this. Not grand gestures, not promises, but small acts, a log on the fire, a bowl of water, the touch of a child's hand on a dog's head. The remnants of broken memories, pieced together quietly, made a fragile sort of shelter against the cold. Night laid its quiet claim on the house, drawing every room tighter, shrinking the world to the small circle of firelight and the slow, uncertain breathing of those within. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling snow around the eaves, sifting it into cracks and corners, whistling through loose panes and under the door. The sounds of the wider world faded, replaced by the steady tick of the kitchen clock and the faint, irregular cough of the ailing puppy curled in the warmth of Magnus's chest. April sat on the floor beside them, legs crossed, hands in her lap. The puppy nestled beneath her palm, every few minutes shivering so hard she could feel the tremor through her own bones. She didn't cry. There was a kind of practiced stillness about her, as if she had learned young that sorrow was something to be endured quietly, so as not to trouble the grown-ups, or maybe the world itself. Magnus shifted to press her body closer, forming a barrier against the night air that pooled along the baseboards and seeped up through the cracked linoleum. Each breath from the big dog steamed in the cold, but she never moved far, never slept too deeply, always alert to the faintest whimper from her small charge. In the kitchen, Len moved softly, careful with every step so as not to startle anyone. He checked the fire, adjusted the damper, made small rounds of the living room, refilling the water bowl, collecting empty cups. He said little, only what was needed, his words brief and steady, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled in the house. Now and then he glanced at April, watched the way her fingers stroked the puppy's ear, the way she rested her cheek against Magnus's shoulder, eyes distant but unafraid. It would have been easier, perhaps, to fill the silence with conversation, to offer reassurances he didn't fully believe. But Len understood the dignity in quiet, the way it let wounds breathe. He'd learned it after the accident, when every well-meant word seemed to scrape raw at something inside him. After a while, people stopped talking, and he found that in the hush there was a kind of mercy, a space where grief could soften and settle, less a wound than a weight you learn to carry. Later, April left the room for a time, returning with a faded quilt, which she draped over Magnus and the puppy. She tucked the corners with careful hands, smoothing every fold, then curled herself against their side, drawing warmth from their bodies. Magnus raised her head to look at Len, holding his gaze for a moment, an unspoken question, or maybe just an acknowledgement that they were all here, all still trying. Len nodded, slow and deliberate. He pulled the old armchair closer to the fire, settled in with his coat still on, and rested his hands on his knees. For a while the house was a portrait. The girl, the dog, the tiny life between them, the silent man on the edge of the circle, each breathing their own part of the darkness, each holding on in their own way. April whispered sometimes, low enough that the words were just a ripple on the air, the syllables blending into the pop of the stove and the sighing of the wind. At times she hummed, a thin, searching tune, something almost remembered from another winter, another bed, perhaps a lullaby from her grandmother. Magnus listened, eyelids heavy, tail thumping a quiet answer on the floor. The hours dragged, every minute stretching itself thin. The puppy's coughing grew worse, a dry rattle in its chest that pulled April further into herself, shoulders hunched, lips pressed tight. Magnus nuzzled the puppy, tongue gentle, eyes wide and searching. Len brought a bowl of warm water, adding a spoonful of sugar, placing it beside April. She nodded, not looking up, and cupped her hand to offer a few drops to the puppy's mouth. Some of it dribbled down its chin, soaking into the quilt. Len's own memories threatened to surface, images of his son, feverish and frail, of sitting through nights that stretched longer than reason, hoping for a morning that sometimes did not come. He opened his notebook, not to write, but to hold, thumbing the worn pages as if they might anchor him to this moment. He listened, let the hush soak into his bones. The puppy's breathing slowed, then quickened, every inhale a fight. He rose, moving quietly through the house, checking the back door, peering into the empty rooms, making himself useful in all the small ways he could. In April's absence, he found evidence of her carefulness everywhere. The small stack of library books on the nightstand, a shoebox filled with notes and pressed wildflowers, a picture of her and her grandmother, both younger, both smiling, taped to the mirror in the hallway. In the kitchen, there was a calendar with the days marked off in blue pen, a reminder of how time passes even when nothing seems to change. Near dawn, April had not slept, but her movements grew slower, her head drooping. Magnus curled protectively around her, warming both girl and puppy, eyes never closing for long. Len returned to the living room, set a glass of water on the table, and draped a blanket over the back of the couch. He took his place again in the armchair, closing his own eyes just for a moment. He drifted in and out, not quite dreaming, aware always of the cold at his feet and the slow, labored breathing of the puppy. The wind rattled the window panes, but inside, the house was still. Sometime near first light, Len looked over to find April awake, eyes ringed with shadow, but calm. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Magnus lifted her head, met Len's gaze, then lowered it again to rest beside the puppy. There were no miracles that night, no sudden turning of the world, just the hard work of holding on, a child, a dog, a man, and the flicker of life between them. It was enough for now, and in the faint gray hush of morning, as the snow eased at last and the fire's warmth seeped deeper into the room, Len understood that sometimes survival itself was an act of hope, a small, stubborn refusal to let go of those left in our care. Day broke slowly over Traverse City, light seeping through frosted windows, painting the living room with a pale blue that made every corner look colder, more fragile. The fire had burned low, and only the occasional hiss of a settling ember filled the hush. April sat in the same spot, back pressed to the couch. Magnus curled around her and the puppy, all three forming a tangled knot of warmth in a world that seemed intent on pulling them apart. The puppy was struggling. Every breath was a tiny, stuttering gasp, ribs fluttering beneath a coat that had grown dull and thin. April's eyes were dry but rimmed red, her body rigid with the effort of holding herself together. She moved gently, barely shifting except to adjust the edge of the quilt, or to cup her hand around the puppy's narrow chest, as if by force of will she might shield it from what was coming. Magnus, for her part, stayed closer than ever, pressing her body to April's, head resting heavily in the girl's lap. There was no sound, no whine, no bark, no plea, just the soft rhythm of dog and girl breathing together, and the faint, uneven pulse of hope and worry between them. The hush was so complete that even Len, seated a few feet away, did not dare break it with words. He watched the slow rise and fall of the puppy's side, felt the gravity of the moment pull at him. He remembered other mornings like this, a hospital waiting room, fluorescent light, the sound of shoes squeaking down a polished hall, holding a child's hand until the last possible second, feeling the weight of everything that couldn't be stopped. It was a different kind of helplessness, this, the kind that comes not from ignorance or fear, but from knowing all too well that some things are beyond any man's reach. Len stood and went to the kitchen, filling a kettle with water. He set it on the stove, moving quietly, every step an effort not to jar the stillness. He found a bottle of honey in a cupboard, mostly crystallized, and a box of chamomile tea, the last few bags crushed in their foil wrappers. He prepared a mug, the simple actions a way to fill the hour, to mark time with care. When it was ready, he carried it to April, setting it on the floor beside her, letting the sweet, warm steam drift into the cold air. She didn't reach for it at first. Instead, she pressed her face against Magnus's head, eyes squeezed shut, shoulders trembling. The puppy coughed, a sound so thin it barely stirred the quilt. April gently lifted the puppy, cradling it in both hands. Magnus shifted, her tongue brushing the puppy's ear, a mother's comfort that carried the weight of old scars. Len kneeled beside them, his knees creaking with age and memory. He didn't touch the girl or the dogs, just placed a small bottle of medicine on the quilt, something he'd picked up at the all-night pharmacy the day before. He didn't say what it was, didn't promise it would help. He only nudged it forward with a slow, steady hand, meeting April's gaze for a heartbeat before looking away. April understood. She opened the bottle and measured out a careful dose, offering it in a spoon to the puppy. Most of it dribbled down its chin, but some reached its tongue, and for a moment, the puppy's eyes fluttered, looking from April to Magnus to the pale morning beyond the window. It was a small victory, barely noticeable, but April's shoulders dropped, just a little, as if she'd found enough hope to last another hour. Magnus circled closer, drawing April and the puppy into her body, a fortress of fur and warmth against the winter beyond the walls. Len sat back on his heels, letting the silence reclaim the space. He looked around the living room, the faded curtains, the cracked glass of the family photos, the threadbare rug that had probably known better days. It was not much, but it was what they had. A place to be together, a place to keep vigil. The hours passed in fragments, measured not by clocks, but by the slow movement of light across the floor, the quiet rise and fall of breathing, the periodic coughs that marked the puppy's struggle. April stayed awake through it all, fighting the gravity of exhaustion, refusing to sleep. Magnus pressed closer each time the puppy whimpered, her own eyes rimmed with worry, but never leaving her post. Len busied himself with small tasks, washing the few dishes, restocking the fire, moving through the house with care. He glanced outside from time to time, watching the way the wind sculpted the drifts, how the world went on indifferent to the tiny crisis unfolding inside these walls. He thought of his own house, empty save for memories, and the truth that some wounds never truly heal. They just change shape, growing quieter, more familiar. That night, April lay down on the floor, arms around Magnus, the puppy tucked between them. Len pulled a second blanket from the closet and draped it over them, then sat in the armchair by the fire, notebook resting on his lap, open to a blank page. He stared at it a long time, thumb pressed into the margin. Instead of writing, he listened, counting each breath, letting the hush draw him closer to sleep. Just before midnight, the puppy whimpered, twisting against April's chest. She woke with a start, pressing her cheek to its side, murmuring something only the dog could hear. Magnus shifted, nudging April's hand with her nose. Len watched as April held the puppy close, rocking ever so slightly, not in hope of miracle, but as a promise to stay. The night was deep and silent, every heartbeat echoing in the hush. In that moment, sacrifice was not a grand gesture, but the willingness to sit beside another's pain, to share warmth, to offer what little comfort one could. No words, no reassurances, just presence, and the stubborn, defiant love that holds on, even at the edge. By dawn, a fragile peace had settled over the house. The world outside remained unchanged, the wind still cold, the snow unbroken. But within these walls, April, Magnus, and Len had passed through another night, bound together by their silent sacrifice, a testament to the quiet endurance that sometimes means more than hope itself. The hours before dawn were the coldest, when even the fire in the stove seemed to hesitate, its glow reduced to coals, flickering in and out of shadow. April lay curled on the floor, one arm around Magnus, the other cradling the puppy, whose breathing was shallow and fitful. Len dozed upright in the armchair, notebook still open across his lap, pencil resting loosely in his hand. The silence in the house was deep and almost sacred, broken only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock and the soft, uneven breath of those keeping vigil. At some point, perhaps in that gray hour when night gives itself up to morning, the puppy gave a final, rattling sigh. It was so soft April nearly missed it. A little stutter, then a stillness that was more complete than any sleep. She knew before she opened her eyes. She lay unmoving, feeling the small body grow cold in her arms. Magnus pressing closer, nose burrowing beneath April's wrist, as if searching for some warmth to reclaim. April closed her eyes, letting the ache bloom quietly inside her, not crying, not calling out, just holding on to what little she could. Len woke to the hush, glancing first to the girl, then the dog, then the unmoving shape between them. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He rose, moving slowly, quietly, kneeling beside April, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. For a while they simply sat, the three of them, the silence thick as snow, the world beyond the window reduced to a slow, gray blur. Magnus stayed perfectly still, her head pressed to April's arm, eyes wide and wet in the low light. Eventually, April stood, lifting the puppy's limp form in both hands. She moved through the house with a kind of careful purpose, Magnus following on silent paws, Len bringing up the rear. They stepped into the morning, cold and white and windless, the air so sharp it made April's eyes water. The yard was a tangle of snowdrifts and frozen grass, a patch of earth near the fence marked by a row of small, haphazard stones, memorials perhaps, to pets or loved ones lost before. April knelt, clearing a space with her mittened hands, the snow powdery and dry. Len fetched a spade from the shed and handed it to her, handle first, then stood back, watching as she dug a shallow hollow in the frozen ground. She worked with slow, determined movements, not rushing, not asking for help. Magnus stayed at her side, her breath clouding the air, tail brushing the snow with every small movement. When the hole was ready, April set the puppy inside, arranging it gently, tucking a piece of the old quilt around its body. She laid her hand on Magnus's head, fingers curling into the rough fur. Len waited until she was finished, then filled the hole, packing the dirt gently, tamping down the snow. The ritual was wordless, heavy with a dignity that comes only from loss. April sat for a moment longer, palm pressed to the cold ground, Magnus lying beside her, head on her lap. There were no tears, just the deep, aching quiet of a child saying goodbye to one of the last small pieces of her world. As they made their way back inside, the sky was beginning to brighten, thin sunlight breaking over the rooftops. April's cheeks were flushed, her hands stiff from cold and effort. Magnus nudged her gently, tongue flicking out to taste the salt on her skin. Len watched them, feeling the old ache in his chest, that familiar sense of helplessness when faced with the quiet courage of someone much younger than her burden. They were halfway up the walk when the incident happened. A delivery truck, moving too fast for the icy street, rounded the corner at the end of the block. April didn't see it. She was lost in her thoughts, head down, shoulders hunched against the wind. Len, arms full of the spade and the quilt, was steps behind. It was Magnus who saw the danger. A shudder ran through her body, muscles coiling, eyes locked on the oncoming vehicle. With a speed and purpose that startled even Len, she surged forward, planting herself squarely between April and the edge of the road, body rigid, tail high. The truck's tires skidded on the frozen slush, a sharp, panicked sound splitting the hush. April froze, eyes wide as the vehicle barreled closer, unsure whether to run or stand still. Magnus barked, a deep, thunderous sound, the first she'd made in all the time Len had known her. The noise snapped April out of her trance. She stumbled backward, slipping on the ice, falling to her knees in the snow. Magnus lunged, placing her body between April and the fender, teeth bared, eyes fierce and unyielding. The truck shuddered to a halt just feet away, the driver's face pale and shocked behind the glass. Len dropped the spade and rushed forward, hands up, heart thundering in his chest. For a moment, no one moved. Magnus stood her ground, chest heaving, refusing to yield even an inch. When the danger passed, April crawled to Magnus, flinging her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in the warm, rough fur. Magnus licked her cheek, whining softly, the tremor in her body giving way to a kind of exhausted relief. Len knelt beside them, laying a steady hand on both girl and dog, letting the adrenaline bleed away into the cold morning. The truck's driver got out, mumbling apologies, voice shaking with remorse and fear. Len spoke quietly, assuring him all was well, ushering him back to his route with a warning to go slower. The man nodded, eyes wide, while hands trembling as he climbed back behind the wheel. When all was quiet again, Len and April and Magnus stood together at the edge of the yard, the snow disturbed in wide, scattered arcs around them. April didn't let go of Magnus. The dog stood tall, battered but unbowed, eyes searching Len's face for something. Understanding, approval, or perhaps just the comfort of being seen as more than a stray. Len met that gaze, feeling something in him settle, a recognition that this dog was more than protector. She was, in her own way, April's last shield, her last hope. And in that moment, as the light grew stronger and the world righted itself around them, the three of them belonged to one another, bound not by blood, but by all they had lost, and all they now refused to lose. That afternoon, the light in Traverse City had a softer cast, the sun filtering through a haze that made the icicles on every eave glow blue and gold. The storm had passed, but winter's grip remained, hard edges on every shadow, air that stung the lungs, an aching stillness inside and out. In the small house on the edge of town, April sat curled on the couch, Magnus beside her, both washed out from the ordeal, both changed by the morning's violence and the night's loss. Len arrived just after 3, carrying 2 things, an old faded coat with fraying cuffs, a boy's coat, heavier than it needed to be, lined with wool worn smooth by years of use. And in his other hand, a thick leather collar, tooled and dark, the kind that grows soft and strong with age. He stood for a moment at the door, letting the cold fall away before stepping inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and grief, but there was something else too, something like hope, tentative but alive. He didn't explain, Len never did. He simply offered the coat to April, setting it on the arm of the couch, and waited. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes flicking to his face and then back again. It was far too big, the sleeves nearly swallowing her hands, but when she slid it over her shoulders, the weight seemed to ground her, the warmth sinking in, gathering around the hollow space left by the past. She said nothing, only hugged the coat tighter, curling into it, as if it could shield her from all the winds of the world. Next, Len knelt beside Magnus, who had watched his every move with that alert, almost human attention. He held the collar out, palm open, not forcing, not coaxing, just letting Magnus choose. The dog's nose brushed the leather, nostrils flaring, taking in scents older than the snow outside. Her gaze lifted to Len, and for the first time her eyes held no wariness, no flicker of doubt, only a quiet trust. Len slipped the collar over her head, fastening the buckle with careful hands. Magnus stood still, tail swaying, a dignity about her that was new and hard-won. April watched this exchange with wide, silent eyes, one hand buried in the pocket of the new coat. There was no ceremony, no words of gratitude or explanation. It was a ritual of belonging, carried out in small gestures, the giving of warmth, the gift of trust, the silent promise to stay. For a while the three sat together in the living room, the only sound, the creak of the stove and the hush of Magnus's breathing. Len stoked the fire, coaxing the flames higher, their flicker painting the walls with gold and amber. April tucked her feet beneath her, drawing a thin, battered book from the side table, a collection of old stories her grandmother had read to her. She traced the cover with one finger, but didn't open it, content for now to sit, surrounded by the presence of those who remained. Magnus paced the room, pausing at the window to watch a pair of crows dart across the gray sky, then returning to curl at April's feet. Now and then, the dog's gaze drifted to Len, who sat in his usual armchair, notebook resting on one knee. He didn't write yet. He simply watched, taking in the shape of the afternoon. A girl, a dog, a house made less empty by the soft, stubborn fact of survival. Outside, the world carried on. Somewhere down the block, a car started, tires crunching over snow. Farther off, the low whine of a distant train echoed across the frozen lake. But inside the house, time seemed to slow, each moment stretching to hold more than fear or memory, each breath a small act of healing. Later, as dusk thickened, Len reached for a battered volume on the mantelpiece. He opened it at random, voice rough from disuse but steady. April looked up, uncertain. Magnus, too, lifted her head, ears tipped forward. Len began to read. A story not about loss, but about a journey through wilderness. Two friends learning to trust each other in the face of long winter nights and all that could not be spoken. He did not mention the accident, or the son who once wore the coat April now held close, or the days when even hope felt too heavy to carry. He only let the words spin out, slow and measured, filling the room with a kind of peace. The story drifted into the hush, rising with the steam from the kettle, twining itself around the old house like a warm scarf. April listened, head resting against Magnus's back, her eyes closing, safe for the first time in a long while. When the reading was finished, no one spoke. Len closed the book, set it aside, and watched as April settled deeper into the coat, the dog's tail curled protectively over her legs. Magnus blinked, then gave a quiet, contented sigh, the sound of trust renewed and made real. The fire burned low, shadows lengthening across the rug. For the first time since winter began, the cold outside seemed less important. The space between the three of them, filled not with questions or old pain, but with presence and gentle attention, became its own kind of shelter. In the silence, Len picked up his notebook and, with slow, careful handwriting, copied a line from the story. Sometimes, all it takes to begin again is to let someone stay beside you, quietly, without promise or explanation. Magnus, hearing the soft scratch of pen on paper, lifted her head, eyes meeting Len's. In that look was everything that needed saying. No past, no future. Just the fragile, holy moment of being together, alive and unafraid. And in that quiet, as night pressed gently on the windows and the old house settled deeper into warmth, the first green shoot of hope broke through the snow, unnoticed, but real. The days that followed unfolded in gentle, deliberate increments, as if the world itself was learning to move slower, careful not to jar the new, fragile balance inside the house. April grew quieter, but not in the way of sorrow. Her silence was different now, a kind of listening, the hush that comes when you no longer fear what might come next. She spent long hours curled by the window with Magnus, her new coat a tent around her knees, watching the slow crawl of clouds across the Michigan sky and the powdery snow melt from the porch eaves. Len returned each day after his shift, boots leaving a careful trail on the cleared walk, arms full with small, necessary things. A carton of milk, a loaf of rye bread, sometimes a can of soup or a bag of dog food. He never made a show of it, simply set the groceries on the counter, wiped his boots, and hung his hat by the door. The rhythm settled into the walls, April and Magnus waiting, the fire already burning, the silence growing less sharp and more companionable with each passing dusk. By the end of the week, the call from the hospital came. April's grandmother, voice thin but steadier than before, spoke through the static of the old house phone. She was coming home, the nurses said, but she would be too frail to care for April and Magnus alone. The news was delivered without ceremony, a fact, not a tragedy, just another change in the long line of changes that had marked April's life. She listened with her head bent, Magnus's chin heavy on her thigh, and nodded before the words had even ended, as if she had already known. That evening, Len stood by the window, the sky outside bruised with the first purples of twilight, and made the offer. His voice was even, quiet, more a statement than a plea. There's room at my place, for both of you. I know it's not the same, but you wouldn't be alone. He didn't reach out or look directly at April, just watched the snow slip from the roof in slow, perfect sheets. April didn't answer at first. She pressed her face to Magnus's collar, let the dog's steady heartbeat anchor her. Change had always come like a cold wind in her life, but this time something in her heart did not shrink from it. Instead, she found herself imagining the unfamiliar shape of Len's house, the warmth of the fire there, the way his hands always moved with careful purpose. The silence between them stretched, gentle and patient. Magnus nuzzled April's cheek, her tail giving a small, hopeful thump. When April finally nodded, it was with a kind of quiet acceptance, the sort that happens only when someone has learned to survive by trusting the goodness in small things. Magnus too? She asked, voice almost smaller than the room could hold. Magnus most of all, Len replied, not needing to say more. The agreement was made in silence, a pact signed not with promises but with presence. The move itself was simple. There was no parade of boxes, no scramble for order or display. Instead, they carried the pieces of April's world one at a time, a single worn photograph of her grandmother tucked into her pocket, a stack of library books gathered in her arms, the battered food bowl that had always been Magnus's, and the blue and white blanket she had slept with since she was little. Len fetched his car from the curb, loaded everything with unhurried hands, Magnus watching from the porch, her eyes following every gesture. The old house, emptied of the weight of waiting, seemed to sigh as they closed the door behind them. The echo of their steps drifting through rooms that would always remember but no longer needed to hold them. Len's home was different, and yet not. It was older, 2 stories and broad-shouldered, perched on the outskirts of Traverse City, with wind-bent trees on either side, and the lake just visible through the kitchen window. There was a porch swing that creaked in the winter wind, a row of boots lined up beneath a coat rack, a faded flag folded neatly in a glass frame by the door. The house smelled of cedar, old coffee, and the kind of warmth that can only come from years of hoping someone else would walk through the door. April moved carefully at first, Magnus glued to her side, tail brushing the floor, nose pressed to every new scent. The first night, April slept in the small room at the top of the stairs, the blue and white blanket tucked around her. Magnus sprawled across her feet. Len sat downstairs, the soft buzz of a late baseball game on the radio, a mug of tea cooling in his hands. He listened to the house breathe, the crackle of the wood stove, the steady hum of the furnace, the faint thump of Magnus's tail against the floorboards above. It took time for the new rhythm to settle in. Some mornings, April woke before dawn, slipping outside with Magnus to watch the sun rise over the lake, the two of them sitting side by side, silent as the world filled with color. Some nights, she helped Len with dinner, her hands awkward at first, then steadier, laughter coming easier as they found the strange, surprising comfort in preparing food for someone else. Magnus found her place in the new home as well, patrolling the halls, curling at Len's feet when he wrote in his notebook, guarding the door with quiet certainty. One evening, as snow fell in soft flurries beyond the porch, April sat with a book open on her lap, Magnus's head heavy in her lap. Len stood at the window watching the darkness gather, and felt a sense of peace that surprised him. An old ache eased, if only for a little while, by the simple act of being there for someone else. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, April still dreamed of the cold house and her grandmother's slow, rasping voice. Len still traced the names in his notebook, still walked the empty rooms with a shadow beside him. But the three of them, imperfect as they were, had found a way to make the silence less lonely. In their small acts, the sharing of a meal, the warming of hands, the steady, loyal watch of a German shepherd, the ache of the past softened, replaced by something like belonging, and in the soft light of evening, with the scent of wood smoke and the warmth of another's presence filling every corner, they began to believe that healing was not something to be won or earned, but simply to be received, quietly, one day at a time. Spring came late that year to Traverse City, as if winter was reluctant to unclench its hold. The snow melted in slow, halting patches, retreating from the porch steps, then slipping away from the edges of the woods. On the first truly warm morning, the lake lay flat and blue, its surface dotted with the silver trails of ducks returning north. The air itself felt softer, edged with the faint, green breath of new grass. It was the sort of day that made even the wounds of the past seem, if not healed, then lighter, more easily carried. In the house at the edge of town, morning sunlight found its way through the kitchen window, painting everything in pale gold. The faded curtains, the old mug Len filled with coffee, the bright flecks in Magnus's fur as she stretched in a patch of warmth on the floor. April sat at the table, feet tucked beneath her on the chair, still wrapped in the boy's coat, though the day promised warmth. She pressed her face to the window pane, watching the trees outside toss in the mild breeze, a quiet smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. Breakfast was slow, unrushed. Len buttered toast, humming under his breath, his hands moving with practiced care. Magnus circled the table, waiting for a scrap, her movements unhurried, her tail brushing the legs of the chairs. It was the kind of morning that felt earned, not given, built from all the nights when hope had been little more than a stubborn ember refusing to go out. After breakfast, the three of them stepped out onto the porch. The yard was a patchwork of last autumn's leaves and new shoots, the ground still soft beneath their feet. Len locked the door behind them out of habit, slipped his notebook into the pocket of his jacket, and nodded toward the lake. his silent invitation understood. They walked together in no particular hurry, April, Magnus, and Len, a trio bound less by words than by the slow, patient accumulation of days shared. April wandered ahead, her hands trailing along the fence posts, her boots leaving soft imprints in the thawing earth. Magnus followed close, sometimes breaking into a slow lope, splashing through puddles left behind by the retreating snow. She darted back and forth, shaking water from her coat, glancing up at April as if to invite her into some private, wordless game. For the first time in months, April laughed, a sound that startled the birds into flight, that made Len pause and catch his breath, as if witnessing a kind of miracle. The sound hung in the air, bright and tentative, then faded into the hush of morning. Magnus, emboldened, splashed farther into the shallows at the edge of the lake, chasing her own shadow, returning triumphant with a stick that April threw again and again. Len watched from the shore, hands in his pockets, his heart steady and full. They lingered by the water for a long while, letting the morning unspool. April's laughter came easier now, and even her silences felt lighter, threaded with curiosity rather than caution. She gathered small stones and lined them up on the shore, building tiny cairns that Magnus knocked over with a nudge of her nose. Len found himself smiling at the sight, the ache in his chest receding until it was only a dull memory, there but no longer in control. When the sun rose higher, they turned back toward home. April trailed behind, stooping to examine an early crocus pushing up through a patch of mud, the bright purple bloom startling against the drab brown. Magnus paused beside her, nose pressed to the flower, as if to memorize its scent for later. Len waited on the porch, watching them, letting the stillness settle around him like a soft blanket. Inside, the house felt different, less an echo of the past, more a promise of what could be. April curled on the couch with her library book, Magnus at her feet, sunlight tracing patterns across the worn rug, and sat nearby, notebook in hand, writing in slow, careful script. No one is truly left behind if there's someone willing to stay. Sometimes healing comes not from changing the past, but from sharing the present, quietly, one small kindness at a time. As he wrote, he looked up to find Magnus watching him, her eyes warm, the slightest hint of a smile in the way her ears tipped forward. April glanced over, catching the exchange, and grinned, a rare, open thing that made her look for a moment, impossibly young and impossibly old. The days grew longer, the air brighter. April started school again, returning each afternoon with stories of new friends, of art class, of the wild ducks nesting by the lake. Len waited for her at the door, always with Magnus at his side, always with the kettle set to boil and the old blue blanket ready. Some evenings, April read aloud to them both, her voice growing more confident, the rooms filling with stories and the sound of a family, one made not by blood or promise, but by choosing, day after day, to remain. And so the season turned, the world inside the little house opening to light and laughter, the wounds of winter softened by the steady presence of those who stayed. There were no grand miracles, only the quiet, everyday kind. A hand held, a meal shared, a dog's steady watch. Enough, it turned out, to close the old circle and open a new one. On the first night the peepers sang in the marshes, Len stood on the porch, notebook in hand. He wrote one last line, the letters careful, the meaning plain. A home is never empty where there is kindness, and no one is truly alone who learns to stay. Magnus lifted her head, as if in answer, and April, standing beside her, looked back at Len. There in the soft darkness, under a sky ready to bloom with stars, three imperfect souls, man, girl, and dog, stood together, their silence rich with all they had lost, and all they had learned to give. The house, once hollow, now breathed with life. The hurt remained, but so did hope, and in the small, healing acts of every day, they learned together what it meant to finally belong. Sometimes healing isn't loud or sudden. It's a quiet presence in the dark, a loyal dog lying at your feet, a hand reaching out when you least expect it, a home made from second chances. Len, April, and Magnus remind us that real family isn't measured by blood or perfection, but by the courage to stay through winter and the grace to let love return, slowly, imperfectly, but enough. If you believe that kindness can change a life, or if you've ever found comfort in the quiet loyalty of a dog, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Maybe there was a time you felt lost, or a simple gesture that brought you back. Or perhaps you too have known the silent miracle of someone choosing to stay. Type "I believe in second chances" if this story touched your heart. And if you're willing, tell us, who has been your Magnus? How did they help you heal? Your story might be the hope someone else needs today.